Hello, good evening, and welcome to this very spooky evening. um, Tonight we're going to be having some ghost stories, and I encourage you to light some candles. We've got both the guardian angel candle, and we've got Saint Death. So you got to keep it balanced a bit. I encourage you to turn your lights off, to read, to sit back, relax, throw a blanket over yourself, and be prepared for these beautiful folk tales told by poet and voice actor, curator, community activist, and stand up comedian Frank Rafferty, who has graced us with his storytelling and his wonderful voice. So, without further ado, we're going to be listening to some ghost tales from Scotland. A liminal space is an in-between space. It doesn't exist all the time, and it doesn't exist for very long. Join me and my amazing guests as they teach us how to navigate through mysteries, graveyards, and the human psyche. I'm your host, Melissa B. On this week's episode,
and the night before their arrival, when the house was empty of furnishings, they said that they heard loud and frightening screams that were coming from some of the upper rooms in Inverrogh.
I hope you're ready for some spooky tales from Scotland, because my guest today is Frank Rafferty. He's a stand-up comedian, a voice actor, a poet. He's lent his tremendous writing skills to community causes, and his spoken word has been featured on the BBC. Frank makes things happen. He's organized, promoted, financed, and performed at arts and literature events, community development. He's a powerful voice everywhere he goes for his community, and he's a very powerful voice when telling ghost stories. So hold on to your hats.
Most of them aren't that well known at all to people, so I would be surprised if you were familiar with any of them, or if any of your listeners were familiar with them. And what I was thinking that I could do is, because they are quite short, a lot of them, I could just copy them and send you a copy of them, rather than you having to get a hold of this particular book. But they're quite short.
I was wondering if you would read one or two for me.
Oh yeah, no problem. No problem. Yes,
That's not
absolutely.
too much of an imposition to ask.
No. I'll do that. I'll put the bigger light on.
Oh, great.
Well, I came across this one in this little book, and it's called The Haunted Bay. "10 miles south of Cape Wrath, on the wild and craggy northeast of Scotland, is the isolated sweep of Sandwood Bay, a peaceful place, if lonely. The only dwelling anywhere near the beach is called Sandwood Cottage, which has been untenanted for many years. This is not entirely surprising, given that both the beach and the cottage are haunted by the ghost of an old sailor. This ghostly man is described as being enormously tall, bearded, and dressed in clothing with sea boots, which is clearly from the 18th century. He wears a long dark cloak and brass buttons on his tunic, and he has laid claim to all the driftwood found on this beach. And on one occasion, he appears from thin air, shouting at a pair of labourers who were gathering firewood, saying that the wood was his property and his alone. The few brave folk who've dared to stay and spend the night in the cottage. I've heard ghostly footsteps, hooves clattering over the roof, the sound of slamming doors and windows being smashed. One visitor to Sandalwood Cottage actually awoke to find himself being smothered by an invisible heavy mass. Come daylight, though, no natural causes for the disturbances can ever be found. No one knows who the sailor is, but he has been seen both by local people, fishermen, crofters, shepherds, and also by many visitors. His materializations are surprisingly frequent, and he disappears just as mysteriously as he appears, sometimes leaving a trail of footprints from the cottage which end at the water's edge. And that's a short tale called The Haunted Bay. But there's any number of these. I mean, recently, my wife and I spent a few nights at a place called the Drovers Inn, which is up in the Highlands of Scotland. Now, Rachel, my wife, has always wanted to go there because there's a story associated with the Drovers Inn, that there's a ghostly figure appears there, and her name too is Rachel.
Rachel.
And so we booked in up there, and we stayed in the room where this ghost is said to appear. Rachel sat up all night waiting to see if she did appear, whereas I just fell asleep. Now, Rachel swears that at some point in the night she felt the room get very, very cold. And given that it was the middle of the summer that we were staying there, and at that point Scotland was in the grip of one of those rarities, a heat wave for Scotland, the fact that the room got so cold in the middle of the night surprised my wife, but it didn't really surprise me. So she didn't actually see anything, but she felt that the atmosphere had clearly got a lot colder. And she said she heard footsteps outside of the room, but it is a hotel. So that, that alone doesn't sort of make me think that, she was in the presence of any sort of ghostly manifestation. But an awful lot of people who stay at the Drovers Inn have actually spoke about having seen this figure.
Rachel.
And it's quite a well-known place, a lot more known than the stories that are in this short book of Scottish folklore. But another one of these is there's a story associated with Inverraw House. Indeed, there's a story associated with many of the older houses and castles and isolated places within Scotland. And Inverraw House is a very large manor house in obviously Inverraw, which is near a place called Tyniult in Argyllshire. And it's the site of one of the most intriguing hauntings in Scotland. Inverraw House is associated with the Campbell clan, and it has been associated with them for over 400 years. It was once the house of a man called Colin Campbell, who was murdered by someone referred to as the Appin Murderer. Mary Queen of Scots herself has visited this house, and history relates that she was particularly impressed by the local salmon that was served to her for dinner. But there are two apparitions that are associated with Inverraw House. The first, according to one tradition, is the murdered foster brother of one Duncan Campbell. And it's said that the spectre of Duncan Campbell has been walking the halls of Inverraw House since the middle of the 18th century. But another legend has it that the ghost is actually that of Duncan Campbell himself, who died of wounds in an attack on a place called Ticonderoga in 1758. The haunted room in the house is itself known as the Ticonderoga room. But a more interesting apparition, and certainly a more romantic one, is that of a golden-haired young lady known as Green Jean, who's said to be a benign ghost, but the history of Green Jean is actually quite intriguing itself. In life, Green Jean is reputed to have been a woman called Mary Cameron, who was betrothed of a young laird of Inverell House, and she was the only survivor of an outbreak of plague which killed off all of her family and their servants. And in a bold, brave effort to save Mary, the young laird of Inverell charged to the rescue, made her bathe in the sea to wash away the infection, and then installed her in a cave far away from the infected area of the time and cared for her until she recovered. It's reputed that they went on to marry and have a large family, and the assumption is that their life itself was a happy one. And apparently, as a thank you for her narrow escape, Green Jean has apparently chosen to remain at Inverell House after death, and she's been seen by a number of the Campbells who've lived there since over the years. It's said that in general she's a polite and a friendly ghost. She graciously opens doors for people on occasions. And although she has obviously frightened a lot of people over the years who weren't expecting to see her at all, a man called Robert Ross, says that when he saw her, he was very surprised, but he didn't feel frightened at all. He was actually driving sheep along the road near the house, and he said he saw her, and his sheep actually stopped to allow her to pass by. And then about a century ago, well, slightly over a century ago, there was new owners that moved into this house. And the night before their arrival, when the house was empty of furnishings, they said that they heard loud and frightening screams that were coming from some of the upper rooms in Inverell. Apparently, the reason for the screams was that Green Jean had appeared, and she was less than happy to finding the home being quite bare and disarranged. I mean, she seemed to be wanting to express her dissatisfaction at the fact that, where is the furniture and everything gone that she was used to wandering among. So that would be another one about Inverell House. But like I say, there's an awful lot of tales that are associated with houses in Scotland. And, well, I mean, you'd know yourself that, most hauntings are to do with specific places associated with the ghosts or the apparitions that they would have been familiar with during their life. I mean, in Derry, here in Northern Ireland, where I live at the moment, they have recently renamed a pub called Lizzie O'Farrell's. It used to be called the Castle Bar, and it's actually, part of it is built into the old walls of Derry, which is a walled city. And the tale associated with that is that there's a young woman in part of the upstairs of the pub who appears from time to time. And this comes from when Derry was a larger port in the 19th century. It's said that this pub, which was called the Castle Bar for a long time, even though there's no castle there, it's just to do with the walls. And the man who ran this bar was an old sailor, and it was also a bit of a house of ill repute. Let's say it was a brothel in those times. And there was a young woman who was taken on as an employee there, not for the brothel, but for the bar itself. Her job was to serve drink and food to the clientele who were coming into the pub at the time. And after a while of doing that job, the old captain who ran the place kept trying to persuade her to, sell more than the wares that were on offer behind the bar to the clientele coming in. But she wasn't very happy with this. But apparently one night, one of the sailors coming into the bar got her to bring food up to the room upstairs. And in attempting to rape this young woman, he murdered her. Now, the captain who ran the bar, the old sea captain who ran the bar, rather than go to the authorities, they got the man back down to the port and onto his ship, persuading the ship to leave early. And basically they dug up the floorboards in the top of this bar and buried the young woman there under the floorboards with a thin layer of soil. And ever since then, people who've worked in this bar say that they don't like going to the upstairs part of it because the temperature fluctuates quite drastically, and they have actually seen the figure of a young woman from time to time on the stairs. And she doesn't really do much, but there's an awful lot of people over the years have sworn that they see her on the stairs, and if they have to go into that upstairs room, the feel changes in the temperature, like it can get really cold. And she's been seen like walking through walls of rooms. Obviously, over the years, the structure of the bar has changed even a bit close to the walls. So some people offering the explanation that she's not moving through walls, she's just going through the space of the room where she was actually murdered. Various tales have been told that at different times over the past century, they've had people in who claim that she definitely exists. There's a definite presence there. They've also had different owners of the bar have had people in trying to get rid of the ghost, if you like. But to date, they haven't been successful.
Thank you so much, Frank, for reading us these stories. And I sincerely hope you can come back and regale us with more tales. And to those of you who have been listening, I hope these stories have put a few chills up your spine. Thanks for listening. See you next time.